because I think that when you have a disability, you cope with those things every single day. There are always new situations, there are always things that you don't know. You always have to cope with a world that is not set up for you. When you know how to do that, you can basically do anything.
Blind Abilities presents Monique Wollan.
Ever since I was little, I just kind of remember things being you either sink or swim. I decided to learn to swim. To me, I guess going to Spain or going to another country was no different than stepping out the front door. It's like you're stepping into the unknown when you go outside. Basically anything could happen. You can meet different kinds of people. Things can be difficult, things can be easy. So there's really not a lot of difference to me.
A success story. Transitioning from high school to college to the workplace.
You may not be able to control certain things and realities of your birth, but you can control what you do with what you're given. I think that's the biggest hurdle that we face, is that employers just see a disability and they see one disability and all the rest of your abilities kind of go out the window.
We hope you enjoy this podcast. And for more podcasts with a blindness perspective, check us out on the web at www.blindabilities.com, on Twitter at blindabilities, and download the free Blind Abilities app from the App Store. That's 2 words, Blind Abilities.
So I think we all need to ask for help. We all are differently abled. So the word disability I don't really care for, because I'm a set of abilities, not a disability, and people are differently abled. I can do a lot of things that a lot of other people can't necessarily do.
Today, our guest is Monique Wollan. She has traveled the world, from China to Nepal to Cameroon, Spain, France, and even North Dakota. She's a beekeeper. She has spent a lot of her time volunteering and working nearly a decade abroad, and now she's here in Minnesota working in the insurance industry. Monique, how you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. Monique, I really want to thank you for taking the time and coming down to the studios and sharing a little bit about yourself with our listeners.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Monique, what kind of work do you do in the insurance industry?
I work in the underwriting department, so what I do is I'm a rater, which means that the underwriters get the information from our clients and the agents, and then they prepare the information and they give it to the raters. And then what we do is we take that information, for example, how many buildings do you have, how many automobiles do you have, et cetera, how many pieces of equipment do you have, and we put them into a rating system, and based on certain factors like the value of your property and the value of the contents and those sorts of things, we come up with a premium that will be a quote for you and the agent or the client. And that's basically what we do, is we kind of prepare those and then we get them back to the underwriter and they're able to quote the insurance policy to the agent.
So what led you to get involved in underwriting for an insurance company?
I actually found the job on Indeed.com and I applied and they contacted me. I had a few interviews and I was hired.
Well, congratulations. How did you start your involvement with State Services for the Blind?
That came about several years ago when I moved back from China I'm originally from North Dakota, but North Dakota is really not a place to live if you have a lot of experience in the international field and international affairs, because I have a master's degree in international development and social change. So I started looking for a job here in the Twin Cities, and I contacted SSB just to see kind of what was new, because I'd been living abroad for, maybe over 10 years on and off. And so I decided that I should probably contact SSB and see what was new as far as technology and services, and I was able to get some updates, and they were able to provide some technology for me.
Oh, that's great. So how was the process for you to become a client of State Services?
It was pretty straightforward because I'm pretty aware of what I need as far as technology and accessibility. And this was something that I had contacted SSB about just simply because when I was a lot younger, technology was definitely not what it is today. And I found it growing up of really, really limited use, any sort of assistive technology, because it was just so limited. And what little was available was very clunky, so to speak, and it just was really not very useful. But since it had been so long, I figured that I should check into this again, and they had obviously a lot of advances, and so I was able to find some things that I knew would be of use to me in almost any job that I would have.
So after leaving high school and going to college, what kind of accommodations did you seek?
I went to Concordia College in Moorhead, and they have a department that helps students with accommodation. And nowadays, I think it would be definitely a lot easier. Back then, it was definitely more of a process. I went to college I graduated from high school in '96. So nowadays, for example, with things like the Kindle and the Canopy Reader and things like that, it would be a lot easier because my main needs for things such as readers, for reading textbooks and those sorts of things. And of course, back then, they were all put onto cassette tapes. So that was kind of a process where you had to actually request your textbooks and have them read, and you were waiting on someone to get them done for you and those sorts of things. So I needed to make sure that those things were available, and Concordia did have them available to me, but I also think that nowadays that would be much less of a consideration just because technology is so much more advanced as far as built-in accessibility.
Well, at Concordia, did you live on campus?
I did.
So what was it like doing laundry and getting groceries in a dorm setting?
That was really, really very easy because everything was available right there. My freshman year, of course, in the dorms, the laundry and those sorts of things were right downstairs. Grocery stores were very near to campus. My sophomore year, I actually lived in Spain. I lived in Pamplona, where they run the Bulls. So I lived with the host family there and walked to the university, and everything was very close. Europe is wonderful as far as accessibility. Because they have such a higher density in population, everything is walkable. It's pretty easy to get around in Europe, much more so than in the U.S. Concordia is a small campus in Moorhead. It's not a big area. So for me, it was very convenient, very easy.
Monique, what were some of the bigger challenges that you faced in high school and college?
High schools and college, I think one of the biggest issues was other people's perceptions. A lot of times in high school and even throughout college and my education, a lot of times if teachers find out that you're in their class, they'll try to get you transferred out before they've even met you. Or sometimes people just don't understand that, for example, you can't read the board, or if you're handed something in small print, you can't read it, even if you've told them you're visually impaired or blind. They just don't even think about it. It's kind of something that's almost outside their ability to fathom. And so they don't understand that it's not that you can't do it, and it's not that you're not an intelligent person, it's that you need something different, and they're just simply not used to thinking that way.
Growing up, who was one of your best advocates?
I was my best advocate. And that was something I learned early on, and that was something that has served me quite well throughout my life, is that you have to remember that you are responsible for your own choices and your own well-being. And that goes with privileges. For example, yes, you have the right to certain opportunities and you have the right to do things that other people can do, but you also have responsibilities, and that means that you need to take care of yourself and what you need and be assertive about what you do need and how you'd like to be treated. Playing into that, I think it's very important, and some people don't quite understand this either when they're younger, or I notice sometimes this happens when people have lost their vision later in life, is they kind of adopt this blind person identity, and that's how they put themselves forward. It's this kind of, look at me, I'm blind. And I think when you present yourself that way to other people, that's how other people are going to treat you. And if you present yourself as a set of abilities and as a human being, that's much more likely to get you treated as such.
A set of abilities. I really like that. So, international affairs. Okay, you've been to Spain. What led you to China?
When I graduated from college, I'd already studied in Spain and traveled in France, and I joined the Peace Corps and went to Cameroon, Africa. So I was a Peace Corps volunteer there for 2 years, and I taught English, so I was what they call a TEFL volunteer, teaching English as a foreign language. And I would prepare the students for their national exams, because in Cameroon, they run on the Francophone system. So they have some tests that they have to pass at the end of certain levels of high school. So I would work with the last 2 levels of high school to prepare the students for those national exams. And if they would pass, they could either go on to the next level, or they would get what they call the BAC, which is short for baccalaureate. And that one is the one that you get to kind of graduate from high school and possibly go on to college. So after Cameroon, I came back to the United States for maybe 2 months or so, and I decided, I haven't gone to Asia yet, so we'll take a look around. And I decided, well, easy way to get to different countries is to teach English, obviously. So China was a very easy place to get a job. I ended up teaching English in a couple of different cities there, and then came back to the U.S. and completed a master's degree in international development and social change from Clark University out in Worcester, Massachusetts. Then after my master's degree, this was really when the economy was kind of taking a dive here in the U.S. And so I actually went back to China for about 3.5, 4 years. and I founded a nonprofit there. And our nonprofit works with the indigenous peoples of China, so the minority populations, which are, for example, you know them here as the Hmong. That's one of the groups over there as well. So we do cultural preservation projects with them. I moved back to the U.S. in 2010, I believe, so a few years ago now. And that's when I came to the Twin Cities because I had decided, North Dakota is probably not the place. Few have international affairs background, but it's also that here in the Twin Cities, as we just discussed, it's much easier to have access to transportation, to have access to the labor markets and those sorts of things. It's just a much more convenient place to live and realistic place to live if you don't drive and you need to have access to larger populations.
So it really doesn't seem like you let your visual impairment hinder you from seeing the world.
I definitely have not. I know a lot of people have commented that I've seen and done a lot more things than they have or could. And I think that's true in the respect that I think that would be really scary for a lot of people to kind of get up and go to a country they'd never seen and don't speak the language and those sorts of things. But for me, it really was not, because I think that when you have a disability, you cope with those things every single day. There are always new situations. There are always things that you don't know. You always have to cope with a world that is not set up for you. When you know how to do that, you can basically do anything.
Well, that's well put. Speaking of worlds that aren't set up for you, what's it like when you go to another country? Do you really have to advocate for yourself to these agencies or these associations that you affiliate with when you go to other countries?
It really depends. A lot of times people don't really notice because they kind of think any differences are because you're a foreigner, not because of anything else. As I just kind of talked about with Spain, Europe is ahead of us as far as visibility of disabilities and understanding about disability. They're politically a lot more organized. Some countries even have quotas for businesses and government, for example. If you're a government agency in a lot of countries, you have to employ people with disabilities, a certain number of them. So those things are kind of much more socially at the forefront for Europe. In third world countries, the developing world, it's actually not as difficult as what people would think, because due to a lower level of general medical care, disabilities are actually more common in certain ways, and it's really kind of seen as normal. A lot of my students, when I lived in Cameroon, some of them were polio survivors, and some of them were meningitis survivors. Some of them were just disabled since birth, and it was just kind of seen as something that's how some people are, and they just go on with their lives.
It's all perspective. So bringing it back home, Monique, what kind of devices or alternative techniques do you utilize at work?
At work, I use a few different things because obviously we handle a lot of paperwork. What we do in the office, we're mostly paperless, but for example, if we receive things from agents or internal documents, things of that nature, we actually do handle some paperwork and fine print. So on my computer, I'm actually set up with Microsoft, and I use the built-in technology. There's a full screen magnifier that you can use in Windows, depending on which version you have, and I just have that set up on my computer. So it was really, really easy to do. When I was hired, it just took about a half hour. I sat down with the tech team and just told them exactly what I needed and how to get it to go, and they had to kind of fiddle with the settings on the computer and put me on the right permissions lists and those sorts of things. But we got that set up. As I said, it took less than an hour. And I also use an eBot, and that's something that I did learn about from SSB. I remember when I was a lot younger, they had those CCTVs that were huge and really not easy to use and were not all that good. I noticed the eBot was a big improvement on that, so I have an extra monitor at my desk, and any documents that I need to read, I just put underneath that eBot, and it puts it up on the screen. It makes it as big as I need to. I can change the colors on it, and that works really well. Oddly enough, my coworkers love it as well because they find things with fine print that they can't read, and they come over to my desk and say, I need your eBot. So they love it. They think it's just great.
How about your smartphone, iPhone or Android?
I use an Android just simply because it's a lot easier to customize. There's a lot more as far as open source software and a lot more that I can do with it. I can't really compare it to iPhone because I've never used an iPhone. I've always used Android.
Oh, my iPhone's embedded, surgically embedded. Monique, I'm gathering from your conversation here that to you, going to another country is just something that you may have considered just being something normal.
Yeah, I think it was because, for example, like I stated earlier, I grew up in mostly small towns in North Dakota, and we don't really have a lot of diversity there. We don't have really very many services at all available. And so ever since I was little, I just kind of remember things being you either sink or swim. And I decided to learn to swim. And once you've done that, and once you've overcome all of those things, which of course as a child you don't really understand those sorts of barriers, but you either learn to do what the other kids are doing, or I guess that's the only choice. So you decide that that's consciously or unconsciously, you decide that that's what you're going to do, and then you need to go out and do it because nobody's going to do it for you. And I never had that for me as far as, people were going to do things for me. It's like, no, I always did things for myself. To me, I guess going to Spain or going to another country was no different than stepping out the front door. It's like you're stepping into the unknown when you go outside. Basically anything could happen. You can meet different kinds of people. Things can be difficult. Things can be easy. So there's really not a lot of difference to me.
That's really neat. Yeah. Of the experiences that you gained from China, Cameroon, France, Spain, what experience have you brought back here that may have changed who you are today, or have they?
It definitely has, and I think that started a long time ago, back in high school for sure, but I think it was before that. I did understand that whether I saw myself as different or not, other people did, and I wasn't always treated very well because of that. And so I saw that there were other people who were kind of few and far between at that time who were also different. And so I figured, well, I'm different and they're different, so we should kind of stick together. That was kind of how I kind of seemed to almost be attracted to people that were different. And so growing up in high school, that was when Castro started letting the boat people come from Cuba, so to speak. And I taught myself to speak Spanish at that time, so I did a lot of interpretation for the refugees that were coming in. And after that, I went off to college. I speak several languages, obviously, and so I double majored in international relations and Spanish, and I have a French minor. And then I went off, of course, around the world because I just figured that, to me, again, that was no different than if I'm a girl and you're a boy, or if you have a blue shirt and I have a red one. To me, that's, we're all different and that's okay. So when I went off and kind of traveled around the world, it definitely kind of gave me an idea that it's okay to be different and that people have a lot of different ways of doing things, and that's completely normal. It also has given me the idea that not everybody responds to things the same or has the same sorts of realities. So for example, when I was living in Nepal, I lived in a place that was up in the mountains, and I worked with the class of people called Dalit. They're untouchables. You might know them as that, but they're called Dalit. And so most of them are illiterate and many times uneducated due to social disadvantage. And so when I was running a health program for them, I worked with a lot of women as far as reproductive health, and then the health program for the village as well. And it just taught me that people come from all sorts of walks of life, and yet nobody can choose how they're born or where they're born, but you do make conscious choices in your life. And if you have your own sense of agency, that is the one thing that you can control. You may not be able to control certain things and realities of your birth, but you can control what you do with what you're given. And sometimes you can't control how other people react to that or what other people do, but you can control what you do. And so it has kind of helped me to help other people to act on their own sense of agency. And it has also taught me that I think about the greater nuances of being a human being. And so coming back to Minnesota, we do have diversity here, definitely in the Twin Cities. But I think that there's not a whole lot of understanding as far as your average everyday Joe living in that sort of society. For example, I think about most of my acquaintances and my good friends, and all of them are from all different places and cultures. And I can go into any one of their houses and sit down to dinner, and I'll know what I'm eating and how to eat it, whether it's with chopsticks or my hands or a knife and fork. I know what it is, I know how to eat it, and I know whatever language is being spoken around the table. And I think for a lot of people, that's not a normal experience, and for me, it's extremely normal. So I think it has expanded my ideas about what's normal and what is not scary. So people always kind of think, well, people with disabilities need help. Well, I can't count the number of times someone has come to me in some sort of situation like that and said, Monique, I need help. They don't understand what language is being spoken. They don't understand what's being served on the table. They need a skill that I have or some information that I have. So I think we all need to ask for help. We all are differently abled. So the word disability I don't really care for, because I'm a set of abilities, not a disability, and people are differently abled. I can do a lot of things that a lot of other people can't necessarily do. And sometimes we all have to ask for help. And in a way, knowing when you need to ask for help is a ticket to independence.
I should be taking notes because this is good stuff. Luckily, I do have the recorder. So, Monique, do you have any hobbies?
As of right now, I own my own home, and I bought the house several years ago, and I have been doing my own landscaping. So I have a very large yard. So I've been doing a lot of landscaping, and I love to garden. So every year I grow a very large vegetable garden, which keeps me occupied. I also am a beekeeper. So I keep track of my hives, and hopefully we'll have some honey again next year. And what else? I also have a parrot, a macaw. So I like to spend time with him, training and teaching him to talk, and all sorts of things. And I also like to cook. So, for example, in the winter, a lot of what I'm doing is, cooking. I'm also a home brewer, and I make my own cheese. I like to bake my own bread. And especially in the winter, I also like to read. Summer, I'm usually outside, but in the winter, I like to read. So I like mostly nonfiction.
So how big of a hive do you have?
A hive?
Yeah, a hive for the bees.
Bees, it's a standard hive, so I don't know how many bees are in there. You can come over and count if you'd like. But it's 3 brood boxes now. And in the spring, depending on how the bees are doing, I might divide it up and then start another hive.
So you get honey from it.
Correct.
That's a lot of hobbies. You stay pretty busy.
I do. No rest for the wicked, right?
There you go. So what got you interested in beehives?
Well, when I was in Cameroon, that was something that we would teach the women to do as far as animal husbandry because it gives them an income. In a lot of parts of the world, women are obviously disadvantaged as far as an income. So it was something that we could teach them to do that they could earn a living from. And then, obviously, as you've said, we have some issues with the bee populations in this country. So it was something that I'd been thinking about for a while. And it's also, I'm trying to do better on the flowers. Normally I like to raise vegetables, but ever since I started keeping bees, I thought, I better do better on the flowers here. So I've been planting a lot of those at just kind of a local source for them.
I think one of the greatest fears about bees is that they will sting you. How do you get around that one?
I've never been stung, and I usually don't use a smoker when I work with them. I have a kind of bees that are extremely docile, so they're pretty happy. When you try to harvest, I think, I wouldn't do it then. But if I'm just checking the hive or making sure they're doing okay and that sort of thing, I don't even use a smoker. As long as you make slow, confident movements, they're pretty happy.
That takes confidence to believe in that, doesn't it?
I guess I've kind of seen it like anything else. It's kind of like training a dog or using equipment in the garden or those sorts of things. It's just as long as you have the information that you need and the tools that you need, then you can do the job.
Monique, do you read?
I do.
And where do you get your sources for reading?
I have a Kindle, and I think that's up on my list for one of the greatest things ever, because ever since those have come out with the text-to-speech feature, I can just download whatever I want, and I can put on my text-to-speech and I can read. So in the winter, I do a lot more reading than in the summer. So I just finished a couple of books on the Human Genome Project. But it's also nice because I can sit and listen to it while I'm doing the dishes or cleaning the house or that sort of thing. But yeah, I read a lot, and especially in the winter.
What suggestions would you have for someone who is transitioning from high school to college to the workplace?
Well, one of the things that I don't want to sound discouraging here, but be very careful about investing in education as far as not only the marketability of your degree or your education, but also the amount of money that you spend on it. I have relatively little debt from my student loans because I'm able to live pretty frugally, but it's pretty difficult for a lot of people to find a job in their field once they've graduated and they have all this debt. And that's much harder if you have a disability because, unfortunately, I think that's the biggest hurdle that we face is that employers just see a disability and they see one disability and all the rest of your abilities kind of go out the window. And so when you have an advanced degree or a college degree and student loan debt and you can't get a job, obviously there's a problem. And that problem is magnified if you have a disability because, again, I think unemployment rates among the blind speak for themselves. They're pretty high. And I know, for example, if you just want to go get a job just to be employed until you can find something in your field or something that you might like a little better. If you don't have a disability, that's a little easier to do, even if you have to do something like wait tables or work in a coffee shop. But if you're blind or visually impaired, that's a lot harder to do. That's not necessarily an option for you. So I think being very mindful about what you invest in education and where you invest it would be my advice. I would definitely do some things differently. And as I think you've gathered, I can do about anything. I'm willing to do about anything. I have a lot of abilities, and it took a long time for me to find steady employment, and especially in something that was a little closer to my education level and experience level.
Wow. From all your travels, your hobbies, and your experiences, nearly a decade abroad, sitting down at an insurance company sounds kind of boring just because of the extreme that you've been in. It started in Spain, and that's right, you taught yourself Spanish.
I taught myself to speak Spanish. I studied it in school, of course, but that's really not how you become fluent in a language. But people often say that as you have a master's degree and all this experience, what are you doing with this? And I think, the simple answer to that is because employers just see disability. They don't see abilities. And that's sad but true. And I think the sooner you face that reality and make choices accordingly, I think you're going to be better off. And right now I have a wonderful employer. I can't say enough good about them. They did not see me as a disability. They saw me for who I was, and they saw me for my abilities. And I've actually been promoted in that company. So they're a smart employer. They saw someone who could advance their company because successful employees make a successful company. And they saw me as who I was and someone who was a great employee for them.
What does blindness, skills, or coping with blindness or dealing with blindness have to do with employers?
If you look at most any job description or opening posting, one of the things that is almost always listed is the ability to problem solve, the ability to think outside the box, the ability to be creative. And being blind is not a job skill in and of itself, and that's why it's important for you not to put yourself out that way as a disability, because if you present yourself as, look at me, I'm blind, then again, that's not something that an employer is going to hire you for. Having said that, I think having a disability or being blind is conducive in some ways to creating certain skills, and one of them is thinking outside the box and being able to problem solve. We have to navigate the world and figure out how to do things in a world that is not set up for us every single day, and probably most of us almost every single minute of every single day. We have to find a way to make things work when we have to do things differently than other people may do them. And employers don't seem to understand that, is that if there's a group of people that knows how to problem solve and knows how to think creatively and think outside the box and do things differently and maintain a constructive, positive attitude about it, it's the blind and disabled. So I think that's a big mistake that kind of employers tend to overlook that sort of skill, because that's a group of people that would definitely have it.
Monique, I really like what you said earlier about how you see yourself projects upon others how they will see you. I think that goes a long ways.
It does, but I think there's also a very high level of ill-informed ideas and kind of ignorant ideas among the general public and a lot of employers as well. And unfortunately, you can't control someone's preconceived notions. You can definitely put yourself out as who you are, but unfortunately, you can't control what other people kind of think or already believe to a certain extent.
Monique, when I was younger, I had this perception that state services for the blind was a safety net. And as I've grown to use it and learned more about state services, I see it now as a vehicle towards the future, incorporating services, assistance, and guidance. How did you find state services for the blind?
I actually just looked them up online because I knew from back in North Dakota that there was obviously a state organization that would have those sorts of services and things, and I figured that I could at least check it out and see what was new. But I've never really had a lot of interaction with a lot of the services that were for the blind or visually impaired, because in a lot of respects growing up they just simply weren't available, and what little was available was of very limited use to me. So I kind of just decided, if I'm going to do this, I've got to do it on my own. So I tried to do a lot of that, and now again, things I think technologically have advanced to the point where they are more useful. Now, one of the things that I've been thinking about over the last few years is, as I mentioned, in Europe, people are a lot more organized as far as their organizations for the blind and disabled. I think having people who are blind or visually impaired in leadership of those organizations is quite important. However, not to the extent that we're excluding people who are not blind or disabled, because I think we need to integrate and interact with the community and population. As I talked about before, you can put yourself out there as who you are, but sometimes people kind of have ill-informed ideas about things, so you're going to constantly struggle against that. But the only way that things are ever going to change is if we're out there doing things and integrating with people and in the communities. I think that's something that I've been quite conscious of and worked on in my own employment, is that obviously not all disabilities are visible, but I know very well that my presence at my employer and in the community is going to change people's attitudes about people with disabilities and what we can and can't do. But for example, obviously I'm employed, I don't take any public assistance, I own my own home, I pay my own bills, and I'm independent. And I think that a lot of people are very surprised by that, and they kind of ask, well, what do you do with your time? Do you volunteer? And I say, no, I have a job. I get up in the morning, I go to work, and I'm completely independent. And that is a new concept for a lot of people.
And thank you for being out there and helping change the limited expectations that society puts upon people with a visual impairment. Well, Monique, thank you very much for taking time out of your day and coming down to the studios here and sharing with our listeners a little bit about your story, a little bit about your journey, and about your bees. And I really appreciate it. I love your perspectives and your insights. So thank you very much, Monique.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
It was a real pleasure to talk to Monique Wollan as she shared her journey, her story, her passions. I did not want the interview to stop. It was so interesting. If you want to find more podcasts with a blindness perspective, check us out on the web at www.blindabilities.com, on Twitter at blindabilities, and download the free Blind Abilities app from the App Store. And that's 2 words, Blind Abilities. I'd like to thank Chichow for his beautiful music, and you can follow Chichow on Twitter at LChichow. I'd like to thank State Services for the Blind, and if you want to contact your state services, be sure to look them up and see what they can do for you. I want to thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed, and until next time, bye-bye.
When we share
what we see
through each other's eyes, we can then begin to bridge the gap between
the limited expectations and the realities of blind abilities.
The realities of blind
abilities.
For more podcasts with a blindness perspective, check us out on the web at www.blindabilities.com, on Twitter at blindabilities. Download our app from the App Store, Blind Abilities, that's 2 words, or send us an email at info@blindabilities.com. Thanks for listening.